I have the honor or dubious honor to have to introduce Mohamed Sharif to his lunch talk. I really think that these lunch talk are incredibly important to the dynamic of the school, and I truly hope that we can keep building a better sense of interaction. And also, I think they are and they should be more informal than the night lectures. So hopefully we can get the students and the people to start to engage in a more open conversation. But I think it's a good opportunity for the students in general to check what your professors are doing, or if they are. It's kind of a balancing check to see if what we claim that we do and we ask you to do, it correlates to what we think that we do in our own practices. This is not specifically for Mohamed. This is more like in general terms where I think these talks are good and useful for us. I was thinking how to introduce Mohamed, which I know him for a while now, but most of our interchange has been through reviews and discussions, and not so much to, let's say, on a table discussing how we design or so on. There always has been in a kind of a more abstract scheme of things to talk. In a weird way, the first idea that popped to mind when I was thinking what to say about Mohamed was, and I don't know how many of you are familiarized with the Coen brothers movie, The Man Who Wasn't There. There's a beautiful part that Scarlett Johansson is driving back with Billy Bob Thornton in the car. And Billy Bob Thornton is this very quiet guy, and she said, "You're quiet and enthusiastic about music." Not that Mohamed has Billy Bob Thornton personality, but I really think that Mohamed is an enthusiastic about our discipline and about architecture. And his commitment to things which somebody like me will never commit, like the LA Forum and a whole series of other activities that are really about, it really talks about the commitment and the passion of somebody about not only the practice of the profession of architecture, but really the discussion of the ideas of the discipline of architecture. And anybody who has been in review with Mohamed or by him will tell you that he's one of the best critics that you can get, not only because his comments and his insight into the eyes of the disciplines is intelligent and smart and well-versed, and also he has a British accent, which it never hurts. But also because it really transpired a passion and a love for the production and the thinking of architecture. So to me, that is actually one of the best thing that somebody can say about the commitment of somebody else to the discipline. So I think hopefully today he will start to reveal how that translates to his own work and to his own ideas. So on that note, I'll leave you with Mohamed.
Thank you so much, Hernan. That was super kind, and thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to start my timer, and if I get to like 40 minutes and just someone yell. I'm going to take the opportunity today to, obviously this is how I feel, and I'm just going to, this is sort of my visual ginger between sushi, pieces of sushi, just to kind of bracket off a moment. I just want to give a bit of context and background to what is now a very faint British accent. I was born and raised in the UK, went to school, went to architecture school in Scotland, in the far northeast of Scotland, and at what was then unabashedly an unreconstructed Miesien school. That was the tagline. So unbeknownst to me, signing up at the school, I was going to go on to a steady diet of straight lines and open plans and all of the things that by that time in the kind of the history of the culture of the discipline had become normative, domesticated, institutionalized, and kind of boring. But anyway, one of the beautiful things to come out of that education, it actually wasn't all that bad, is that I had an opportunity 20 years ago to go to IIT in Chicago as an exchange student. And again, unbeknownst to me, I think this happens to a lot of us in this field, that you kind of sign up for something and don't quite get what you thought you came for, but it's often better. In any case, here I am on my way to study here with this guy looming large in my mind, and sharpen 9Hs and all of that stuff. And of course, Mies, the paragon of beauty, and all of the things that by that time had become institutionalized as kind of as classical and humanist, only to be overheard in the corridor by one of the newest hires at the school, Ben Nicholson, who snagged me and my Scottish classmate on the first day and said, "Hey, why don't you join this new studio?" Little did we know that we'd signed up for something altogether different. In any case, Ben was, we spent a year studying the Laurentian Library, making our own bracha scales, doing altogether thoroughly, at least on the face of things, un-Miesien things. If the studio next door, which was run by then, and he was still alive, Alfred Caldwell, Alfred Caldwell, an amazing landscape architect who worked with Mies for a long time. His studio was the Brick House studio, and here we were next door. One of the things about being at IIT and working in Crown Hall is that you become incredibly acutely aware of your presence on the face of the planet, and as thin as the buildings were, as ethereal as they longed to be, you still got a definite sense of threshold that I find it's very difficult to have anywhere else in the world. But you were aware you started to become aware of the other aspects of me, so the weight, the heaviness, the strange proportions, the other stuff that wasn't so easily circumscribed by a kind of a classical humanist agenda or story. And there was something about being in that place that really put you elsewhere. And of course, it took someone like Ben to help us see that and to make the connections with Mies's early Berlin days and his Dadaist buddies. Here's I think actually Peter Cook showed this slide a couple of weeks ago. One of his close friends was Kurt Schwitters, and this was the first Merzbau. I think this is a reconstruction, but it's interesting that the rational and the irrational become quite close bedfellows, and apparently Schwitters actually built a cave for Mies as an homage to Mies somewhere in this mess. And of course, this is one of Mies's Schwitters' collages out of his own private collection, and it's not a stretch to see that, again, this issue of the rational and the irrational being quite close bedfellows. Working with Ben, as difficult as it was, in the best sense of the word, was eye-opening to post-humanist Mies, to proto-postmodern Mies, to the architect who would draw glass and charcoal and call forth the reflection, the refraction, and everything else that commentators like Michael Hayes have really done a good job explaining. That was eye-opening. It wasn't a stretch to make the connections between the kinds of inquiries and investment in pattern making and pattern scrutiny and the black and the white that Ben was into. And so, in all, this is still with me. I give you that as a bit of context. Now, just what I'm going to do is talk about 7 projects. I'm going to open with a trio, and then there's one in the middle, and then close with a trio. The first 3 comprise a finalist competition entry for a remodel of a library, auditorium at the Rhode Island School of Design, the Department of Architecture, which I did a few years ago with a colleague, my good friend Maria Guest. We were teaching together. I was going back and forth there. The second project is a library, a commission for the RISD library adaptation. The third project is an exhibit which sort of showcased models and some drawings for those schemes. I'm going to talk about the one in the middle is a kind of a minor obsession / speculation that comes out of that for a site, but not really for a site at all here in Santa Monica. And then I'm going to close with 3 interiors, and I'm going to try to be really quick. So, like I said, the lecture hall at RISD. I know Devin. I think Devin's in here. Nathan's in here. A few of us. Todd, you're familiar with this. But flying to and from RISD, especially in the fall, all I could think of on the plane was Joseph Beuys's felt coat, and that somehow you just wanted to slather yourself in something like that because it was so damn cold. And at the same time, kind of being somehow inspired. The piece on the right is by an LA artist, Joshua Callahan. I think it's called Imperial Skywalker. And there's something quite beautiful about that piece that was sort of, again, about the almost kind of Duchampian, obviously, and then the sort of culture of Victorian utensils, this fish strainer, that somehow all of this percolated at 35,000 feet quite a few times. I don't quite know why. We did this project really quickly, and what it was essentially was, I have a pointer, I guess. This is the existing lecture hall. That's not the orientation. The only move in this project was to sort of say, look, you know, when you come in, and again, Nathan, Devin, you'll remember this, Peter maybe, that when you came into the building, there was something kind of undecorous, let's say, or lacked decorum, in that you always saw the profiles of the people sitting in the room. So the move here was to just essentially reorient the room, and next I will show you work the ceiling diffusers under this kind of like enlarged sort of T-strainer scape, and beneath that put a curtain track system because they wanted to be able to use this room for simultaneous reviews. So essentially it was a kind of an implement hanging, 2 implements hanging from the ceiling, running slightly askew of one another, deliberately, sort of anticipating more of a almost Victorian way of making, and then lining the room with something that ended up being more of a kind of a techno mucosa than the felt kind of tobacco stained liner. Sorry, it's a very fuzzy image. Anyway, here are some shots of the model and the whole idea of this piece. Again, it was a 2-layer ceiling piece and then a wall liner. So I'll go through that really quickly. The imagery, and these are some of the effects that we were looking for. This project came second, but the lovely thing about it coming second, so it was somewhere over here, is that they said, well, actually, there's a project further up the road that you guys might want to do, and it was the existing library that had been vacated when Nader and Monica had essentially recast another building on campus for the new Fleet Library, which is a beautiful major interior project. If you've not seen it, you should. Oops. So this was the space. Essentially, when we walked into the room, the only thing that was different was there was no furniture and no books on the shelves. It was actually quite a beautiful empty shelf. And the move here was essentially to work on the guardrail. Sorry, the remit was to make this kind of a multi-purpose classroom. It's a space that's shared by Brown and Risdi, and it's actually a very informal space. There are, poetry classes go on. It's pretty freestyle. So went through a series of studies, but really concentrated on the inner lining, the inner shell that would set up a system of spaces in the existing kind of library organization itself, differentiate them, change the proportion of the room, and compress this all with a ceiling that had acoustical functions to attenuate the kind of the bounciness of the space, but one that actually didn't enter into the kind of visual indexing of an acoustical treatment, but worked hard at actually becoming, multiplying the room visually as a reflective membrane. And that sort of came down onto the room to change its proportions as well. I think one of the sort of the inspirations, I think always too, is someone like Gerhard Richter and the ability to do what he does is something that causes great envy. And of course, this came up at a review a couple of days ago, but there's a lineage, of course. Anyway, went through a series of studies of different configurations and ended up with, sorry, it's good on my screen, it's burned out here. But essentially what we ended up doing is concentrating, can you see that? I can't see that from here, no. All right, this will give you an idea. You come into the space, it's like on the second floor of a 5-story building, huge building. You come up, you come in sort of laterally, and then you're into the room. And opposite you is a nice large north-facing window, and then you're out onto the street. So here's that guardrail liner that I mentioned, and we sort of offset the surfaces and concentrated on developing a kind of and so you came in here, you turned, and part of the program was that you would have big sort of lectures as well every once in a while. So what we did was visually concentrate kind of a three-dimensionalized cones of vision and begin to crinkle and crimp the liner at the guardrail up above, make it highly active in this area, and sleeve it into one of the existing study carrels to create a kind of a lounge, and then sort of relaxed it around that edge. So offsetting it, upsetting it, and then making it relax. And the fun part, of course, was then starting to kind of develop an attitude towards the stray interstitial spaces and weaving in a kind of a new vertical kind of up the petticoat sort of situation. So these are some of the studies. Again, the idea of actually coming down into the height of the room and compressing it and working that tension around the edge and then multiplying it was the big move. So here's some shots of the model. That would be the entry. And I think I mentioned that there's an obsession that sort of came out of this that is still with me, and it was these sort of conoidal hourglass figures that were starting to pop out of the accordioning that was happening at the guardrail. There's a secondary system here of curtains, and in a way like Schwitter's caves in his Merzbau. So down below, up above, and then we were interested in developing a kind of a really dumb system of spreading this membrane, and it was essentially by thinking in terms of just hanging balls to spread them, so you ended up with something that was not so pointed, but started to find, you start to find arches and vaults in that surface as well. And that's it. And next, very quickly, how am I doing for time? That's so bad. Okay, is the exhibition that resulted. That last project went through DD. We were paid and everything was great, and then the stock market crashed and they lost all their money, blah, blah, the usual story. But in any case, what came out of it was an exhibit that really focused our attention on building some models and getting some material out. I think one of the qualities that we were looking for in that exhibit was this kind of surface tension, a kind of lightness and buoyancy, and that moment, this is Cocteau's Orpheus, where you feel like you might be getting sucked into something. Very simply, this is the entry into the architecture school at RISD. The lecture hall that I mentioned to begin with is actually over here. And what we did was we built a couple of models, and this was our little invention, which was a series of, you'll see that in a second, a series of laser-cut aluminum fins made into 4-foot panels and then wrapped with something that approximated what would have, at a very minor scale, what the ceiling of that library might have looked like. And again, it was sort of this interest in moving from, and then there were these big kind of laser-cut, glowy, ecstatic drawings that just operated in the light. What was really interesting was sort of moving from the extreme two-dimensionality to the 2.5 dimensionality of the piece by means of these bubblegum pink foam balls that were just friction placed onto these fins. And I think the idea here was also to kind of just go into a kind of a delirious space. So the paper thinness of these guys, hanging them, and I actually liked that very much, and then sort of developing a system of measles or rubella that allow us to just spread that guy. And sort of release that moment in between. And then I always, this is sort of like the shot that is somehow vaguely rude, but anyway. So in the meantime, I've been obsessing about that hourglass that just won't go away, that conoidal thing, and was kind of working on a site that we set the RISD students at the time, which was on Santa Monica, 14th and Santa Monica. I think, John, this is where we got our Christmas tree last year. So what happened about a year and a half ago, not even, January 2010, is all of a sudden this site, which was an overflow parking lot for a car dealership, had sort of sat empty for a while. And, back in that sort of when the food truck thing was first a craze, all of a sudden all the kind of the digerati tweeted into existence an open-air food court. And the site that, that you drive by kind of every day, which is kind of almost nothing, all of a sudden became lively. And of course, 2 days later, the city shut it down because of all sorts of health issues, blah, blah, blah. Now, not being interested in taco trucks or mapping or tweeting or that stuff, but I was interested in the phenomenon all of a sudden that this thing was actually a bona fide public space, and sort of set the RISD students this kind of this task of imagining what you would do as an architect pre and post taco, that you might actually begin to imagine again a civil infrastructural scale of public space for a public yet to be determined. Let me go. So this is the site kind of. And at the same time, I was thinking about the kind of the emphatic, the way that the hyperstyle hall lands emphatically in space, claims it, and how, you know, one of the legacies of technology, modernism, is that, you know, this stuff has gone away. So in a way, I think what the taco trucks reminded me of was a moment where, you know, that somehow that a discipline would land here and would endure and exist and allow other things to happen. It used to be called, I don't know, urban design maybe, I don't know, but but at the same time, you're thinking of these figures, you're thinking of these old hypostyle halls, you're thinking of the sky that's come through in the millennia, and obviously the you know, cheesy, corny, but at the same time, the notion of the hourglass, its affiliation with obviously with time and sand and glass and all of this stuff, and Tyrannia's Danteum, and also longing for a moment in a city where you could have something as clear and brooding as this. I'm very interested in what Ignacio de Sola Morales, the late Ignacio de Sola Morales, has written about our discipline. I'm very interested in how he's come to terms with the understanding of weak architecture and the decorative and monumentality. And I was going to read out a bunch of quotes, but I'm just going to keep going. But these all sort of, these ideas linger for me. So it is this, you know, it's this site on a grid in a town, city that's plain vanilla. It's almost in the geographic middle. And it's one that, you know, has that pier and kind of the grid and the mountains, and you know it all. And I was thinking, well, what if you made a public space that somehow called on the spirits of the discipline, called on the hypostyle hall, that kind of glyph, and actually melted it into the sky? How would you enlist the hourglass to help you? And developed a project essentially for a roofscape, an arboretum, something that marks the territory, that calibrates it at a large scale. So, like puppeteers, looking at these hourglass figures, starting to develop an attitude about packing the circles, starting to think about old-fashioned words like loggia and arcade and colonnade, and how these might actually begin to appear, and working these guys and sort of landing in the middle of a messy problem where things weren't quite jiving, looking at sort of character development from the solid, the massive, the volumetric, to the filigree, to the skeletal, and just kind of really enjoying the abstract, autonomous quality of this exercise, and starting to think at the scale of kind of a civic scale of sort of jewelry and a monumentality and a kind of weakness and a tangentiality and a lack of index of immediate use, but all hopefully to think about, you know, the passage of time, to think about the sky pouring in. Anyway, so this was a sort of the first iteration, and it produced a strange-looking animal, which was very unexpected, completely weird, at least for me, in my own kind of. And so we've been working backwards in a way from the middle of that, kind of trying to sort of post-rationalize and re-rationalize the next version of this guy. And it started to hit the ground with strange elephantine columns, and it's taken on many guises, and it produces, again, strangely proportioned spaces and places, and we're just drawing it. Up and through it and around it. And more, I think of Mises' New National Gallery, about that inky presence, that brooding quality, and how that might materialize in different ways. Very quickly then, how am I doing for time? 35, 20, good. 3 projects from the muddle of anywhere. These are projects that are built. 2 of them are a little old, but the third, I think, is kind of the. I have to show them because the third one, I think, is the end of this sort of condition. And I don't mean this as a commentary on sprawl or on. It is what it is. I find myself. It's the Koolhaas. Junk space definition of it's like being in I think a tepid jacuzzi with 1,000 people you don't know. That's sort of the urban experience, and there's something comforting about it, and it's also repelling simultaneously. And one of the things that I found when we moved here about 14 years ago, it's the gaze of the military, is I felt sort of like this. I felt that the buildings that I was looking at were looking at me back like that, and that somehow what you really longed for was a wink. And that working in a big office, and actually which had enormous value in many ways, and at kind of the first .com boom, that you had friends who had sort of weird jobs that all of a sudden had money to make space, so you did it around, you did it off hours, and sometimes you also you felt like that, right? Doing it in environments where, doing that kind of work on the side in environments like this, where carved up kind of corporate lunches, very strange and kind of unsettling to see this sort of culture of consumerist coercion around the free lunch, and deciding that whatever you did in your free time would be somehow opposite that kind of aimless grazing culture. And so thinking about the muddle of anywhere, thinking about the role of the architect in an existing context. Actually, I wouldn't even call it a context. It would be more like a circumstance. Punctuation was always something that was in the back of the mind as something that you could hold on to as an architect. And for my Spanish-speaking friends, those guys. But the ones that I preferred the most out of the punctuation list was these guys. And somehow that the architecture or the interior architecture would somehow bracket off or hyphenate or, do to, the urban equivalent of this Delphic, the utterance, you will go, you will return, not in the battle you will perish. Do something very slight and maybe just change things up a little bit, and not so much be a meaning in and of itself, but allow other things to develop other personalities. I always felt like that the projects were sort of faxed in, that somehow the brief was as fuzzy as the kind of the strange moment of kind of getting a project and you arrive somewhere and the front door is in the middle of a maze, and somehow everything that you learn about entry and threshold and all of that just sort of goes out the window. This was a small office for a friend who was a video game editor then. I mean, that was a great job. And they basically needed to remodel this space. That's the front door off of the lobby on the nth floor somewhere that was fuzzy. But somehow to acknowledge the kind of the entry, to tear invent one wall to tear it away from the other, and then throw it off kilter slightly to kind of make a nod to the front door and sort of gesture to the small passage that would ensue. That was the kind of the trick there. And to really do next to nothing, not as a kind of a minimalist thing without that piety, but really to just be more kind of in your face as quickly as possible and then out of the way. The next one is for two sisters who started a website development company and actually survived. And this was on the second floor of an existing building. What we kept was the core. It used to be kind of a rabbit warren of rooms and a fire corridor, and that was cleaned out to let in 4 quite magnificent sort of skylight shafts, and essentially concentrate the worker offices in the middle of what became a free plan, and open workstation area in the back. They wanted a sleeping platform, a yoga room, and so sort of developing this kind of as a program diagram, and then starting to spatialize it more to sort of kick the space into motion with a language of very gentle tilts, and to enlist, as with the other, that was the thing with the free lunches. I think that kind of traumatized private. When you'd hear things like accent colors, you sort of would wonder, like, what accent? And so that we had developed this attitude towards color in the office as again, like this kind of strange Morse code, in that you would either use like a fecal palette, or you would use sort of palettes that would sort of verge on kind of gender switching and kind of androgyny. So that's all it is. And the mail slot becomes the only thing that winks at you when you come through the door on the nth floor, and the thing tilts and turns. You release all of the skylights in here. And then I think the big invention was kind of like when you tell your kid to not play with his belly button or his bum will fall off, was to sort of unhinge the space in the back a little bit and kind of create that moment of uncertainty, or kind of, I mean, I think, if anything, I think that what I really secretly always long for is the unheimlich moment, the moment where things actually seem like you're treading on eggshells, and that was the big investment. This is the last project. It's for my wife. She's an awesome client, and it's recently finished, and it's her office. This is on a more specific. I mean, it wasn't faxed through, but I have to tell you, it felt like that all through the process. This is an interior in an existing building, which is on the corner of 14th and Broadway in Santa Monica. It's at the first floor level, and it's the only interior, I think, that has exterior ramifications in terms of its presence on the grid. It's about 70 feet long, 30 feet deep. It has the entry's there at the street corner. And this is what we inherited, was the first TI space, which suffers a bit from the kind of a hyper-style moment down one line. But it pretty much, that's sort of structural situation made for very quick planning strategy, which was to basically concentrate reception and entry and greeting, records, x-ray, consult, open plan operatory, office, private exam, sterile, lab, kitchen, kind of as a first diagram. And the rule was that whatever ended up this side of the columns would actually register more as an object and would hold true, clear of the facade, because at a certain level you find like you don't want to have anything to do with it for so many reasons. And again, with a language of tilts and sort of gently rocking back and forth. This isn't exactly up to date, but the idea was that you would sort of guide people through, and the place would operate kind of self-evidently. That's kind of the sort of a three-dimensionalization of the servant-served diagram, and then the beginning of a development of these guys as objects, and then thinking, this is not such a great slide, about the potential of color and hue to come into it more as a fluttering effect than as an added kind of than as paint. The Tugendhat is always in the mind. It is one of those projects that is a kind of a modernist enfilade that unveils itself along facade. I think it's Mies's the sumptuousness, the kind of it's his luxuriant qualities, and you could go on and on. But that was always something that was there, sort of as the idea of somehow hues and surfaces. Anyway, so this is what it is in the world. It's very, let's say, it has no real face. Like I said, it pulls back at the two moments that it comes close to this kind of garden variety, sort of small M mod, everyday kind of Santa Monica building. And as we'll see as we get closer, you can't really see in, you can sense in, and it has a sort of a simple graphic quality about it and starts to gain depth, I think, by virtue of this move at the back, which we'll see in a second. This is what it was. Looked like a crime scene. It was essentially, bare bones. This is what it is in the world again. This is what it is now. I have Brandon Shigeta and Taya Watanabe to thank for some of these photos, and the great Monica Novans for some others. But again, the things like the reception desk become your kind of sumptuous move, and needed a kind of a heaviness and a way to sort of punctuate and push through, guide people through the space. This is its place in the world. It's a place that has many color temperatures. It enjoys really good daylight. It's essentially, you don't really need to switch the lights on. And as you go down, that other hue that I was talking about starts to come up. So you're always aware of what's going on outside. I think for me, it's the idea of something that we've been talking about in our studio with the students. That in a way, this is the framework for a graphic novel that will get written and rewritten every day. So you're always aware of what's outside, what's leaking through. And this is one of the moves, which is kind of like that wink and that private again, is that you're working. Your medium is essentially kind of a commercial vernacular. It's a world of generic stuff, and the most you can hope for is a really crisp corner, which are very hard to come by. So there's this kind of like this moment where that room sort of pulls back. It allows this this space to bleed through, so that when you come through here, you get a sense of continuity. So it's moments like that where you get the these are the only kind of bespoke details where things just start to tilt away at a strange angle. It gets a little bit sci-fi at night. The acrylic panels that are hung up, they kind of react to light depending on its direction, and it gets kind of warm and glowy. That's usually when I'm in there. And again, like sort of moments like the wink that I was talking about earlier, is that you get these odd situations where you have to deal with things like the pipe from the balcony above, and then you develop a kind of a resonance with some of the pieces in the room. And that's kind of it. I think I'm done. That was quick.